We've all seen it before. Whenever a great memorable character shows up on screen, it's only a matter of time before a string of subsequent knockoff flicks cram in a similar character clearly modelled off the original. Just look at Joe Dante's Gremlins, a wildly original family horror comedy upon its release in 1984, balancing scares and laughs while toning down the harsher edges of screenwriter Chris Columbus's screenplay. Cut to 1990, and before Dante could even put together a direct sequel, the multiplex had been flooded with 3 Critters films, Gremlins but R-rated and from space, 3 Ghoulies flicks, Gremlins but vaguely supernatural, and even a lone Munchies, Gremlins but they grant wishes, I think? Roger Corman half-assed this rip-off so badly that sequels transitioned into being E.T. knockoffs instead. There's nothing worse than seeing an original character shamelessly ripped off, with the carbon copy characters leaving audiences bored of their favourite figures before they've even had a chance to appear in a sequel. With this in mind, we've collected the most shameless cases of creators copy and pasting characters from better works and hoping no one would notice. For shame, filmmakers. I'm Kirsten from WhatCulture, and these are 10 ripped-off characters movies didn't even try to hide. Number 10. King FRAT ripped off Animal House. There are few comedy characters that are as iconic as the late John Belushi's Bluto Blutarsky. Taking inspiration from the SNL legend's own larger-than-life persona, Bluto was ID personified for a generation who grew up with John Landis's Animal House as the touchstone of anarchic comedy. The rambunctious, rowdy, but ultimately mostly well-intentioned Bluto soon went on to become the victim of more plagiarism than Ralph Bakshi and Robert Williams combined, as the winning combination of sweet and chaotic fueled countless Animal House knockoffs. None, however, were quite as egregious as King FRAT, which went as far as commissioning a sound-alike theme song that ripped off Animal Houses. The most shameless rip-off in the flick came in the form of the familiar figure, the titular King FRAT, who's a hard, partying, lovable scamp who fears his endless drinking and goofing off may be ended by a mean dean who finds his frat antics insufferable. So this is starting to sound a bit familiar. Number 9. WISHMASTER ripped off Freddy Krueger. When you hear the phrase semi-supernatural slasher, in which some form of campy demonic entity uses the wildest dreams of teens to ensnare and murder them one by one in creative ways, it's pretty clear who we're talking about. Any horror fan worth their salt will know we mean the Wishmaster, a powerful djinn whose presence is felt throughout the history of fantasy slasher hybrids. What's that? The Wishmaster wasn't your first thought? Was it by any chance Robert Englund's incredibly famous icon of horror, Freddy Krueger, the star of Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street series, who's infamous enough to have been parodied in everything from Rick and Morty to The Simpsons' Treehouse of Horror series? Well, much as it may shock you to learn this, most cinema-goers actually thought of Freddy when they first saw the djinn's grinning, punning debut on the big screen in 1997. This may be due to executive producer Wes Craven's influence, or Robert Englund's own cameo in the first flick as an antiques collector, but it's more likely due to the fact that the djinn is a more shameless rip-off of Freddy Krueger than Scary Terry. Despite the character's transparent origins, he did go on to star in a franchise of his own, though the djinn could never hope to escape the shadow of his nightmarish inspiration. Number 8. Mac and Me ripped off E.T. E.T. left a pretty massive impression on American cinema upon its release in 1982, as Steven Spielberg flicks tend to. The film at the time was the highest grossing movie ever made, a record set by Spielberg's own Jaws and bested by his later Jurassic Park. So in this context, it was inevitable that, like Joe Dante's mischievous Gremlins, Spielberg's raisin-faced Alien would prompt a string of rip-offs varying in quality. Deep down at the bottom of the mortifying pile lies 1988's Mac and Me, a film whose limited special effects serve as a pretty great reminder of everything Spielberg's earlier film got so right. Outside of a wheelchair-bound protagonist, the film offers no meaningful divergence from E.T.'s blueprint, slavishly recreating the film while also managing to strip it of its charm and, naturally, originality. Lest you feel compelled to defend the film for its attempted diversity, however, it's worth noting that said wheelchair-bound protagonist is tossed off a cliff come the climax in a melodramatic moment so poorly handled that it remains a running joke between Ant-Man star Paul Rudd and late-night host Conan O'Brien decades later. Number 7. Hobgoblins ripped off Gremlins. Okay, so we really had our pick of the ugly litter for this entry, but Hobgoblins stood out as the worst of a bad batch. When Joe Dante's horror comedy classic Gremlins hit cinemas in 1984, it was bound to produce an endless stream of imitators, given how irresistibly simple the concept of pint-sized terrors invading small-town Americana was. And indeed it did, with everything from Critters to Ghoulies to even whatever the hell Munchies are, soon flooding the multiplexes in the following years. However, the single most shameless ripoff came in the form of 1989's HOBGOBLINS. The titular threats not only resembled gremlins, but they also made their victims' fantasies into reality, not unlike the aforementioned wish-granting munchies. You know things aren't ideal when you're reduced to ripping off munchies. And far from ideal the film turned out to be, with director Rick Sloane's efforts going on to be judged one of the worst movies ever made, but also fodder for one of the Mystery Science Theatre's 3000's most beloved episodes. Swings and roundabouts. Sometimes wishes come true in ways we never expect, just like in the classic Gremlins ripoff Munchies. Number 6, Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, ripped off Carrie. Okay, so we really could have included any of the Friday the 13th series in this entry, given the fact that Sean S. Cunningham's iconic abandoned summer camp slasher was originally envisioned as a fairly shameless cash-in on the success of John Carpenter's Halloween a year or two earlier. That said, the first film is actually a twisty whodunit which doesn't feature Jason until its closing minutes, and even the first film's follow-up eschewed a masked killer in favour of, well, Jason with a sack on his head. So, not as scary, but not too shameless and Michael Myers Xerox. Yes, from the third installment onwards, the two silent stalking mass murderers were all but impossible to tell apart, but the seventh installment of Jason's long-running saga actually features a far more shameless and inexplicable ripoff. Among the cadre of new characters introduced only to be killed off was Tina. Tina is a teenage girl who accidentally uses her previously latent telekinetic powers to kill her abusive parent after being pushed around one too many. Morrissey, is that you? Because you'll need to stop me if you think that you've heard this one before. The Carrie knockoff came almost a decade after the release of Brian De Palma's adaptation of Stephen King's debut, and the decision to rip the character off years after her peak popularity wasn't enough to stop critics reviling Jason's seventh outing. Number 5, Mighty Joe Young ripped off King Kong. There's no two ways around it. The eponymous simian from King Kong may be irreplaceable, but that hasn't stopped generations of filmmakers from trying to ape his success. Whether it's South Korea's infamous attempt APE, the gender bender variant Queen Kong, or 80s icon John Landis's debut Schlock, countless creators have tried to convert titular giant apes into box office gold like they were, well, Jack Black and Peter Jackson's King Kong. Chief amongst these efforts is Mighty Joe Young, a rare rip-off so successful it actually led to a remake of its own. The original 1949 movie did share a significant chunk of King Kong's crew, but the shamelessness was still palpable to audiences as the creators banded together again in search of the previous film's magic. Critics were not kind to the king who would be Kong, but the film was nonetheless popular enough to warrant a remake helmed by the Mummy's Stephen Sommers a few years before Peter Jackson tried his hand at remaking the greatest grape ape flick of all. Number 4, Transformers 2 ripped off Terminator 2. This one isn't an entire film populated with rip-off characters, and unlike a lot of this list, the knockoff isn't central to the plot, but it's nonetheless worth noting thanks to the sheer shamelessness of its creators. Michael Bay isn't admittedly a director beloved for his originality, but 2007 saw the helm of surprise critics with a funny, likeable coming-of-age Transformers adaptation largely carried by Shia LaBeouf's performance. The sequel inevitably escalated the stakes at the cost of quiet character beats, reducing a fun summer blockbuster to a parade of explosions and leg-humping robots. It was inevitable that a film this messy would have too many racist robot caricatures for every critique to get an airing, but few reviewers noted how blatantly an early scene ripped off James Cameron's classic Terminator 2, Judgment Day. When our hero Sam Witwicky manages to pull a cute co-ed despite doing nothing to win her affections, it's pretty obvious something strange is afoot, and indeed, moments later said co-ed is revealed to be a robot in disguise. Specifically, a robot disguised as a human, who melts into shards of shiny metal to reconstruct herself. It's a setup that will sound familiar to fans of Robert Patrick's implacable T-1000, and it will sound egregiously out of place when we note that there are no human Transformers in the franchise until this scene, and none appear or are even alluded to for the rest of the film. Number 3, Pumpkinhead ripped off Alien. This one stings, because we all love effects maestro Stan Winston's iconic contributions to genre filmmaking. The Monster Man has a place in our hearts alongside Tom Savini and the granddad of on-screen monsterdom, Ray Harryhausen. But his superb work on everything from the Terminator series to the Alien movies to the era-defining effects he contributed to Jurassic Park. And there's nothing wrong with cribbing a bit of inspiration here and there, like sneaking the odd answer on a test you pretty much answered by yourself. Pumpkinhead's plot, for example, is fun and inventive, Narrative, a gruesome, darkly comic cautionary folktale which could have come from the pen of Stephen King or one of the Tales from the Crypt's more inspired outings. The flick follows a grieving father who summons the titular monster to exact revenge on a gang who killed his young son, only for the ghoul to wreak more havoc than anticipated, which should come as no surprise since from his first appearance on screen it's pretty clear Pumpkinhead bears as close a resemblance to Alien's eponymous xenomorph as any piece of produce. The exoskeletal spine and pointy limbs are strike one, but his elongated skull pretty much seals it. Still, Winston had a hand in the original Alien, so we can excuse a bit of self-plagiarism. Number 2, the Bye Bye Man ripped off Slenderman. Less defensible than a lot of examples on this list, the Bye Bye Man's case isn't helped by his insane name and the fact that his film debut is an absolute waste of time. A typical January horror release, the film is almost impossible to follow, yet somehow also absurdly slow and thin on plotting. It sees the titular ghoul, unseen for most of its runtime, stalking the dreams and minds of a small group of insufferable college students, and is apparently based on an obscure short story detailing the exploits of a supposedly real urban myth. When the long-awaited Bye Bye Man, yes, they keep calling him that name, no, it doesn't get any less funny with repetition, finally arrives on screen, his origins are pretty clear to anyone familiar with the internet culture. The Bye Bye Man's bony, long-fingered, pale countenance is immediately recognisable as a carbon copy of Slenderman, a controversial creepypasta character. This appeal to meme culture didn't stop critics from savaging the Bye Bye Man upon release. But don't worry about poor Slendy. He soon got a film of his own a year later, which was, you know, also promptly torn to shreds by critics. Number 1, Aquaman ripped off Alien. That's right, Stan Winston's work on Alien is iconic enough to make not one, but 2 appearances on this list. So eminently copyable was the Xenomorph's awesome monster design. We won't lie, we could have padded out this entire list with a string of Alien clones, given how many flicks ripped off Ridley Scott's sci-fi horror classic. Outside of the aforementioned Pumpkinhead, there's Outriders of Avengers Infinity War, the titular Species in Species, not in their Natasha Hendridge form, mind. The creature featured in 1985's Creature, at least Extra made a bizarre backwards man monster for its story of space traveller gone wrong, but we had to include 2018's Aquaman due to how shamelessly its underwater dwelling villains ripped off Ripley's infamous nemesis. Despite having millions to spend on CGI and innovative monster design, the production eventually settled on an eyeless, clawed, thin black reptile with rows of small sharp teeth and an elongated skull. Well, I guess if it ain't broke. The monstrous Trench may be getting a horror spin-off of their own, where we'll no doubt be surprised to learn that they procreate via face-hugging, as long as we never get another Prometheus-style prequel. And that's our list. What was your favourite ripped-off movie character? Let us know in the comments below. If you haven't already, please subscribe, but for now, I've been Kirsten from WhatCulture, and I'll see you in the next one.